What I wanted to say was, if we think of some of the factors, right, off the top of my head, the obvious ones are things like, at least in terms of what fans think, salary inflation. They know some of these players make, I mean, if you saw the Cloud9 reveals, essentially, as far as I can tell, someone like ErikHillestad makes like $40,000 a month or something crazy. They've heard Astralis is on a lot of money. I'm sure they know that it's got to be the case that G2 pays a lot. You know, people have a sense for these things. Also, there's the factors of, like, you know, league spots, marketing, do they do content? There's a lot of angles we can go with this. So I thought maybe where I'd start with this is, do you want to start with the salary topic? Do you think that's a pertinent topic to start with?
Go ahead, bro.
Sure.
Okay, so the perception goes like this. Back in the day, it's actually, funnily enough, around the time both your organisations came into the game. I think off the top of my head, you both came in 2015. Right? Around that period of time was when actually the salary inflation and explosion really began. That was back when, if we went to the beginning of the year, based on my sources, like the top salary in the world might have been like, you know, 5,000 euros a month or something. Let's say dollars, just to be safe for Americans. $5,000 a month, right?
It was actually even less.
Could well have been. Yeah, could maybe have even been, 4,000, 3,000. By the end of that year, there were already teams above that level, and some of them, this is the crazy thing, weren't even the number one teams, because they were the teams where it was basically, the joke is, as the inflation happened over that year, like a curve going upwards, that whether you got paid wasn't based on how good you were, it's based on whether your contracts had ended and you signed with a new org and you had the bidding war for you. So it's one of the reasons why, if people don't know, there was that bizarre scenario where TSM had the core of what's now Astralis and was one of the best teams in the world, but they wanted to leave TSM because what happened was, as the salary inflation went up and they were in a position to potentially renegotiate, well, a team like TSM looked and was like, these salaries are getting out of control. I don't want to be in the game for this. Like, what do I get back for that? Because actually, at the time, a big consideration was teams like TSM obviously want the whole content factory on the side, and players in CS didn't do it. In fact, players used to even say, even if they'd signed it in the contract, like, oh, we're too busy, we have to practice, you know, if we're number one, we have to stay on top. So in terms of salary stuff, right, people know that it's only a couple of years after that. It was famously with teams like Virtus Pro and North when it was publicised. Already we're at the level, we're talking 2 years later, where now it's like $20,000 a month. People are going up to $25,000 a month. And I've said now, the top end, you can get up to 40, maybe more. Sure, not for lots of teams. That's certainly not the case. That's the extreme end. I'd say if people think of the top teams in terms of orgs, but with top players who are performing well, I'd say think more in the range of like 18 to 25k. That's probably more where a lot of these teams are at. And then you have a few teams where they overperform in terms of in the server, and fans just don't understand the org. Like if you're someone like ENCE, you were never paying anywhere close to that, even when you were considered like, you know, number 2 in the world. Yeah. So let's start with that. Nazgul, obviously I've never had you on any of my shows before. Where do you come down on the whole issue in CS of the salaries in terms of where they're at, and obviously the inflation angle? Because I will say, it is worth pointing out, you can't judge that in isolation. Obviously, it has to be things like, well, is it worth the money in that sense? Like people can't just look at the number and overreact, right? And be like, wow, getting that much for being a CS player. So where do you come down on like where the salaries are at in the game? Like, is it an issue?
I think the short answer is no, it is not an issue. I do think you're right about a lot of the points that you bring up. Let me just say, like, for a Team Liquid, where maybe if you look at it from the outside, you feel like the salaries are quite high. The reason for that, honestly, it's a choice from the teams. It's a choice to be a part of a growing industry and to raise capital against that growth to make sure that in the future we are at the top of this industry. It is true that the salaries for the vast majority of the organizations are higher than the revenues that we're making from Counter-Strike. That's
significantly? In CS?
It could be significantly so for some organizations. I think that really depends. Like, some are probably closer to break even than others. Okay. But generally speaking, the salaries are higher than the revenues. And we are doing that because we see growth. We believe that by paying these salaries, we can get certain rights, right? Commercial rights, whether that's to sell sponsorships or to monetize the media rights, or to position ourselves to be part of leagues like Blast and ESL. We believe that we can grow into that, but that is the reality of the situation. And if a player, for example, or the CSPPA does not understand that dynamic, does not understand that these organizations need these commercial rights to sort of make up against the salaries that are already being played, then you can start to see friction and you can start to see some issues arise. But at its core, I don't see it as a problem. I would say for myself, honestly, the only real outlier is probably Cloud9. I do think skill versus salary wise, from what they're sharing publicly, they are a huge outlier, even compared to the G2s, the Team Liquids, and Astralises of the world. Not to say that specifically their dollars are so far above ours, but for the type of player that they are attracting, I do think that there's a discrepancy.
Overpaid.
Yeah, but there's of course like a strategical reason for that. I mean,
Yes.
you can decide whether or not you think it's right or wrong. But the thing is, if you want to build a roster from scratch, from absolutely nothing, and you go to a top player, you're gonna have to overpay. Because like if Liquid goes to Fallen, for example, Fallen has a huge desire and drive to play with our 4 other players. That helps it in our negotiation. If we went to Fallen and said we had no other players, he would say, pay me 3 times as much because I'm taking such a huge risk with my career to build something from scratch. And therefore, if you really want to start from scratch, like so ambitiously, and you don't want to build on a 5-year plan, which I would not agree with. I don't think it's a strategy that we would follow, and Liquid has had a long-term plan for Counter-Strike. But if you did that, you would have to pay these type of salaries, and that is the real explanation. What would worry me there is that, and actually I've been talking to some Liquid players about this, like, hey, these salaries are high because the players are taking huge risks, and we're now seeing that already dropping a player, parting ways with their coach, and that is the reason. So it's not the same situation. If you want to make the same, you should be taking the same risk, and that's a matter of education. Yes. My worry would be that it sets a new standard for skill versus compensation that we all become those huge outliers, and that is really problematic. And a part of me even fears that if this does not work after a year or 2 years, that Cloud9 will not be here to be dealing with that, and we will be. So I definitely have some concerns there.
What do you think, Carlos?
Yeah, I think Victor explained. I agree with a lot of what Victor said, but I'd add on top of that, it's the issue with what the players are getting paid when compared or relative to the value they generate in and outside the game. That in and by itself is not a problem, right? The problem comes with things such as what Victor said of agents or a lot of third parties just pushing for unreasonable new standards, like these players having sponsorship rights and things of that nature. Because all of a sudden, we're in a position where we're like, yeah, we can't monetize this shit. I'm out, right?
Yes.
Now, you can argue that in games that have a lot of potential, you can argue that you can sometimes, not always, but sometimes make the sacrifice of saying, look, I will sacrifice my short and midterm financial gain, so I will lose even more money because I believe in the long tail of the game, right?
Okay.
And because I believe this is it's an investment on the game itself. I want to be relevant today so that tomorrow, any new player that comes gravitates towards becoming a fan of G2, right?
Okay.
And because you believe the game will keep on growing. Now, Counter-Strike is not in that luxurious position. Counter-Strike is a staple and will be there for many years. Now, I think it's hard to argue that all of a sudden the game will explode again and triple viewership in the next couple of years. That's very unlikely, right?
Yes.
So that makes all of a sudden aggressive investments less appealing, because even investors, right, they're going to be asking you, I mean, what's the potential gain here? What is my 20x here, right? And you're like, yeah, well, it's Counter-Strike. You want to be there, but there's no 20x inside. And that's the challenge, right? Then when you're in that position, and that's a position that agents, CSPPA, players, everybody has to acknowledge as real. The game will not explode. It will just not. That's a fact. People that are growing up playing different games more often than not. So this is more like a legacy game to be a part of, which means you're going to be less willing to sacrifice short and midterm gain, which means that, I mean, I will not, if an agent comes to me, like there's a couple of agencies, one of them here in Europe, relatively new, fucking annoying, just pushing for incredibly unreasonable standards. And you're like, listen, I don't know. I mean, if Vitality or if Team Liquid or whatever is going to give you this, good for you, brother. Good for you. But I'm not, okay? So you can go fuck yourself. It's that simple. And if enough Carloses tell these agencies to go fuck themselves, at some point this shit explodes.
Sure. I mean, by the way, if people are wondering, because this ties in actually to what Nazgul alluded to there about his players, that is not at all uncommon, by the way, that sentiment. I'm talking to the fans, obviously, here. Like, one of the main things that has driven the salary inflation is not what people might naively think if they're from outside esports, which is just traditional market forces of, like, you know, Team A will pay you this much, Team A, B will pay you this much, and you choose between or you make them bid against each other. That would be one thing if it was just that the org owners were idiots and they were just driving each other up, like a certain League of Legends org that came in, let's say, Season 6. Oh, whatever, just a little one aside there. No, what really causes this issue, actually, is what the sentiment that Nazgul said. It's that players don't know the business, and so what they do is they hear player X will make up the number 30k a month, right?
Yeah, and they go, also like the information. Like they take it on a vacuum, you know?
Yes, could also be a rumor, as you say, yeah. But then the worst thing is they think, literally, but I'm better than player X, or I beat him in that, you know, I placed ahead of him. And they think that that directly should translate to the next salary amount. Like, they don't seem to actually understand what forces dictate the salary that you have. Like, I've seen some cases, I won't say who, but people can probably guess. I've seen some cases of players who did some of the worst deals I've ever seen. There's some agents that did some terrible deals where they overshot a really good offer from an org when they didn't even have a backup in their pocket. Then they don't get it from the org. They have to leave that org. And then it's like, the joke is, it's as if the agent goes, good news, I've got you a deal. We're on minus 10k salary now. Like, great, what are you doing? Like, I've seen that happen where they weren't even actually, like, at the negotiating table with any kind of leverage. But they thought they had all the leverage because they thought it was about how good they are in the game. So I will say players kind of not knowing anything about the business side. And then, as you say, Carlos, like, the problem is the people they're bringing in to do the business. Like, if fans don't get it, that guy makes more money if that player signs for more money because he gets his percentage. So he is incentivized to get that player the most money ever because he's getting himself more money if he does that. So I agree. There's some forces where when I hear people say those complaints, because they say it in CS all the time, and they've said it now about Valorant a lot, like, these idiot orgs just inflating the salaries. It's like, mate, how are you going to get in the game if you don't pay some of these salaries? Like, you're just not going to be there's going to be some idiot will pay that, or they will push for that. And so essentially, you're not going to get the top talent unless you get in this world, and this is why the problems necessitate a show like this.
I always say there's no magic, right?
Yes.
There's literally no magic. You can get maybe, in this case, a couple of teams overpaying, but either shit goes back to sustainable or close to that, or it will explode. There's no magic. Like, at some point, enough teams will say, fuck this shit. And either the salaries will just halven. And I think there was a year, actually, by the way. And by the way, I'm speaking also from the point of view of, I was in the position of my team was fucking irrelevant. I mean, my team was called Gamers 2, brother. And it was irrelevant. Nobody wanted to play for me, okay? Nobody. Carlos was a clown. Nobody respected him. And Gamers 2
was a clown?
Is a clown. Okay, fair enough. I give you that, okay? I'll give you that. Carlos was and is a clown. And nobody respects Gamers 2, and it was fucking hard to get players. So I had to fucking overpay. I remember player salaries. NIP was getting paid 500 euros a month, each player. And that was like top NIP, right? And then I had to get Polish players on board, which Innocent and Minis and all these guys. And they were getting paid, you know, about the same. And then very quickly after, I was like, I want to make a step forward. That was in 2015, September, I think. And I put together this team with Scream, Michael, Ellie, and stuff, right? And all of a sudden, from 500 on average that you'd find in a tier 1 team, it became 4,000. That was the moment it became 4,000. And then 3-4 months after, it became 6,000. So I was part of the problem, right? And soon after, a year after, with the famous French super team, then it all became 25,000. And why is that? Because everybody was being played against each other, and because I was irrelevant. Gamers 2, G2 Esports was irrelevant, so you had to overpay, right? And then a new standard has been created, right? And now things would be all right if that standard, you know, of getting paid more was kept alongside the power that the teams were going to exchange with, which is this, you know, the IP rights, right? So that you are able to monetize that player. And so that you can get advantageous terms when it comes to digital revenue items and things like that. But all of a sudden, you see things get pushed also on the other end. Then at some point, it's literally impossible to manage the business. So I will say that right now, things are not unbearable, okay? But we are certainly a little worried of the tendencies we see, some of the tendencies we see.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I agree with Carlos on the subject of the closer your game is to maturation, and that's not a bad spot to be in per se at all. I think Counter-Strike is going to be at the top of esports for a really, really long time. But the closer you are to maturation, the less your investment indeed relies on the growth of the game, and the more it relies on can you take the current audience, can you conclude that you're under monetizing, and can you conclude that you can do a better job in monetizing what already exists. And when that is the case, you simply do need to push to break even a little bit quicker than in a different situation where you're investing like really early into the lifespan of a game. So I agree with that, but I think I do think it's a bit of a chicken and egg story. And speaking for our players, honestly, like I think they are actually very reasonable about the business side of things, and we can have these type of conversations. So I feel pretty good about that. But to some extent, right, it is an agent's job to push like, hey, this guy got paid that much for this level of skill set. You should pay my player this much. It's hard to say like, hey, you should be asking for less. Those are probably the arguments that they need to make. Those probably are the arguments that players need to make. I just hope that it comes from a good spot and a spot of understanding of playing the game of negotiation, and not a spot of like being upset or angry that you don't get those numbers. And I think that's really important. As long as you can all stay level-headed and you can look at it that way, I think we're going to be fine. But if it becomes emotional of like, oh my God, I hate you because you don't pay me as much as I see over there, then I think it becomes problematic.
Yeah, and not only that, it's just this us versus them mentality, and you know, teams making too much money when it's obviously not the truth. I mean, it's certainly that is the tricky part, because when you start from a point of when you start thinking about this relationship from an angle of, oh, we must fuck teams as much as humanly possible because they're making a lot of money of having us here, then you're coming up with some of the terrible initiatives that we have seen some parties come up with, right?
Sure.
That over push, you know, and that is where the problems come, because I do think that there's always is a nice healthy balance, you know, to have pushy agents, pushy teams, pushy leagues, and I guess a publisher that doesn't give a fuck. But it's a nice, you know, it's a nice little balance, right?
They even each other out if they're done correctly. Sure.
What?
It evens itself out, like, you know, if you both push back at each other, it's going to work itself out if everyone has the right intention, sure.